But Ed, I'd love it if you could tell us the story of the 1953 expedition. How did it come about that this British expedition, where the summit of Everest was announced on the day of Queen Elizabeth's coronation, but it was summited by a Kiwi and a Nepali or Nepali Tibetan, Tenzing? Like, let's talk a bit about how there is that interplay between the political and colonial objectives of climbing, but then there's this kind of brotherhood of the rope on the mountain. And were those at odds? Like, can you tell us how that moment came to be? And then also, how was Tenzing treated afterwards? And how was his treatment different than that of Edmund Hillary through that lens?
Yes, it was a British expedition. Ed Hillary was on it because of Eric Shipton, really. Eric Shipton there was a reconnaissance in 1935, which is the expedition, pre-war expedition I would most like to have been on, because it just turned into a massive holiday of people avoiding the main subject, which was climbing Everest, and climbed loads of other peaks just for fun. And that was Tenzing's first trip with Eric Shipton. He got him it's a bit like acting, you couldn't get a card to be an actor unless you'd been an actor, but you couldn't be an actor unless you had a card for Union Card. You had to go on an Everest trip to be picked for an Everest trip. So Tenzing's selection was chance, really, and thanks to Eric Shipton. But Shipton also developed a soft spot for New Zealand climbers, and he took them too. He took them along. So, when Shipton went back to Everest after the war in 1951, another Everest expedition, he wanted to have Kiwis along. And then they made it into the 53 trip. But of course, Hillary and Tenzing were not the first team to try for the top. That was Tom Bourdillon and Charles Evans. And they may well have climbed it if their oxygen equipment had proved more reliable, because they had a different kind of oxygen equipment that was much more effective. And it only broke down sort of on the South Summit. So John Hunt, who was the leader of the 53 trip, I think his intention was to have Brits climb it first, but he had a very, very useful backup plan, which was Hillary and Tenzing. Plus, I think John Hunt was a pretty decent man. He's a very ambitious man, but I think he was also pretty decent too. And he kind of had bought into this new Elizabethan era, the idea of the Commonwealth rather than empire and, brotherhood of nations. And can we just please step quietly away from our empire as in its peaceful,
Nothing to see here,
non-violent and non-judgmental way as we possibly can, please, because we're bankrupt and we need to move on. So, but I think it's rather nice. I really like the idea of a local. Tenzing was born under Everest, so I really like the idea of him being the guy. And he had more experience of Everest than anybody else at that point. So again, it was very appropriate. As for his nationality, that is a can of worms that I'll leave you with for a later program.
Yes, indeed. But it serves to mention that the first summit of Everest happened after the East India Company was dissolved, after the British colonial experiment in India ended, after partition. So it's fascinating through that. And I guess just to follow up, was Tenzing as celebrated as Ed?
Not by the establishment, no. I think it's humiliating for us the way we treated Tenzing, frankly. Ed Hillary was knighted for climbing Everest. Tenzing got the George Medal. And
so we recognized him, but not the same as okay, well, that's
like when you think about what a George Medal is ordinarily given for, which is to firemen for rescuing children from burning buildings. It's like the dutiful sort of servant class, courageous behavior. It's not the guy with agency. And that's shocking, really is. Yeah, quite angry about that. But that, the Foreign Office could be flagrantly racist.